Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS Webinar, Not Just the Bookkeeper, Planning and Describing Your Work with Promotions and Tenure in Mind. I'm Felicity Dykes, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. Our presenters today are Lizzy Walker, Metadata and Digital Initiatives Librarian, and Ginger Williams, Acquisitions Librarian and Associate Professor, both from Wichita State University. Librarians at Wichita State are tenure track. Lizzy is a first-year tenure track librarian, and Ginger has achieved tenure. So we'll be hearing from them on two different perspectives. Everyone in the audience is muted. So if you have questions for Lizzy and Ginger, please type them into the question box on your screen. They'll answer the questions following their presentation. And if we go over time, they'll answer them offline, and we'll send all the participants a copy of those. So please note that today's session is recorded, will be recorded, and you'll receive an email with a link to the recording and slides. We don't have a chat function that allows you to chat with each other. If you like, please use that Twitter hashtag on the screen to chat about today's session. We're not going to monitor that, so again, please use that question box for questions and comments. And now, here's Lizzy. There'll be a slight delay as we switch speakers.
Hello, I'm Lizzy Walker, a first-year librarian trying to figure out how to communicate my value as a professional technical services librarian for the purpose of earning tenure and promotion. I believe that technical services is an essential part of user services, despite the fact that it is often seen as separate from the public role of librarianship. But how in the world do I convey that to others?
And I'm Ginger Williams, a tenured member of the library faculty. When I submitted my third-year review back in 2007, the Tenure and Promotion Committee said my description of my work made me sound like just a bookkeeper. They also said I was doing an excellent job as library faculty. And they spent an extraordinary amount of time giving me specific examples of ways I could describe my work so that I would sound like a faculty member who supported the university's mission. I really appreciate that, and I hope this is helpful to you the way they helped me. Our goal today is to do two things. First, to help you think strategically about your career. And second, to help you think about how to describe your work so you don't sound like you're just a bookkeeper or just a data entry clerk.
As Ginger mentioned, strategy is very important. Think strategically about your career. Your library should have a tenure and promotion policy if librarians are tenure eligible. If your library doesn't have a tenure policy, your library should have a promotion policy or a librarian evaluation policy. We're going to refer to this today as the T&P policy.
We don't want to waste your time saying your tenure policy or your promotion policy or whatever you happen to have. I noticed that we have several students in the audience, so I'm going to start by explaining tenure. I sometimes hear people on the street say that tenured faculty have a job for life. They generally disapprove of this idea. No matter how bad you are, you can't get fired. That's not quite true. Tenure protects academic freedom. When you hold tenure, you can't be fired just for expressing controversial opinions. If you happen to say that you think that the president of your university is an idiot in public, he may not be happy about that, but he can't fire you for saying that. If you say, and there is actually a tenured faculty member who was doing a lot of this in the 1980s, that the Holocaust never happened, that it was all made up, he could not be fired just for expressing a very controversial opinion, even though he showed up in the newspapers on a regular basis for having said this opinion publicly. He was tenured. They couldn't fire him for expressing a controversial opinion. But you can be fired when you have tenure. I actually know somebody who was. It's very rare, but it does happen. The person I know got fired because he got tenure and promptly quit coming to work. And for about 3 years, he didn't come to work most of the time, and when he occasionally did come to work, he went directly to his office, closed and locked the door, and refused to answer the telephone. It took several years, but they eventually revoked his tenure and fired him. So, tenure protects academic freedom. It is not a job for life. Now that I've said that, if you get hired on the tenure track, you've been hired on probation. Your university is saying, this is a person that we expect to be very successful, and we expect to be worth giving the protection of tenure. If you're a new librarian, that's your goal. If you're in a tenure-eligible institution, to make tenure. Because if you're in a tenure-eligible institution and you don't make tenure, one day your boss is going to come to you and say, I am so sorry. I'll do anything I can to help you find another job. At least we hope that's what your boss will say. But there's no reason for somebody not to make tenure. If you get hired in a tenure-eligible position, that means you're capable of achieving tenure. And if you get hired in a position that has promotion potential, you're capable of being promoted. You just have to plan. So how do you get started planning? Look at your T&P policy. The T&P policy outlines what you have to do to be successful at your institution. Think of it as the template for a flight path. You need to get really, really familiar with your T&P policy, as you're going to need to know how to taxi along the runway, get into the air, and achieve a cruising altitude in your career.
The first thing to realize is that not all T&P policies are created alike. Look at these 3 examples that we have up on the screen now. Boise State University evaluates on 4 areas, Wichita State University on 3, and University of South Carolina on 2. Our policy at Wichita State spells out the percentages for our work effort, but the other 2 don't. So you need to kind of pay attention to how, what your breakdown is per your institution. You need to plan your career on what you will be evaluated on.
Look at your T&P policy carefully and figure out what you're going to be evaluated on. One of the areas that I notice in a lot of T&P policies is reputation. They may not say the word reputation, but they will refer to it in some way. For example, Boise State and Wichita State both refer to reputation.
Boise State talks about service at a local, regional, or national level. That suggests that a really strong reputation in your state professional organization might just meet the requirement for service. But you might want to talk with your primary evaluator and the T&P committee about it. If you stick to service on in the local area, your library may expect much more than if you do some national service.
Wichita State, where we are, talks about regional, national, and international scholarship. It actually says that to achieve a promotion to associate professor, you have to have scholarship at a regional or national level. To achieve full professor, you have to have established a reputation as a scholar at a national or international level. I've been encouraging Lizzy to focus on national scholarship. One day, she may want to go up for full professor. I would encourage her to, since you get a raise when you get a promotion at this university. We don't get that many raises. Raises are nice. Your T&P policy will have a lot of information. During your first year on the job, get really familiar with what your policy says, and chat with lots of experienced librarians about what they expect. Remember, T&P decisions are not made by just one person, so get multiple opinions from experienced librarians at your institution, and listen for them to say, as the T&P policy says, If they're not referring back to the T&P policy, you need to be doing it. They could be just expressing their opinion. If it's not in writing on that paper as a requirement, take it with a large grain of salt.
And sometimes the criteria for promotion aren't exactly the same as the criteria for tenure. Remember, it's promotion and tenure, or tenure and promotion. They certainly aren't the same here at Wichita State. If they aren't the same at your library, you'll probably have to plan to meet both criteria.
Here at Wichita State, they're very similar, but they're just a little bit different. And while there's not a requirement that we have to get to achieve promotion in order to be tenured, nobody has achieved promotion at this university, has achieved tenure at this university without being promoted for the last dozen years. So we're going to go for both sets of criteria.
As a first-year librarian, my primary evaluator had me focus on learning my role here. I knew a lot of theory from library school, of course, as we do, and also had previous experience as a staff member at another academic institution. I needed to learn local practice, policies, and then put all of that library school theory to work.
One of the things that I told Lizzy to be careful about was taking on too. Lizzy,
Yes.
what's the first thing you should say after you've been asked to be on a committee during your first year?
That sounds really interesting. Let me talk with my primary evaluator and I will get back to you.
Very good. You notice she has that memorized. It's not that I didn't want Lizzy to do any service during her first year, and you probably should do service your first year too if that's a requirement. But librarians tend to do way too much service. So talk to your primary evaluator, or whatever they call the person at your library who's your mentor and supervisor, and get in the habit of helping them protect you a little bit. They want you to be successful, and if you get stuck on too many committees too fast, you will not be successful.
I did a little service, but I focused primarily, of course, on learning my job. And I also finished an article I was co-writing with my previous supervisor.
Lizzy was an overachiever in research during her first year, with an article accepted before she had been here 6 months. The T&P committee was happy with that. Her primary evaluator was very happy with her growing independence in her work. She volunteered for the library's strategic planning team, a short-term service activity that helped her learn the library's culture. Most importantly, she spent time learning what our T&P guidelines say and figuring out how to balance the 3 areas of responsibility that librarians are evaluated on here. Her career plane has gained speed on the runway and is ready to get into the air.
So how am I going to get into the air my second year? Well, for starters, I have added to my job skill set, and I'm now training staff on RDA. I'm also drafting guidelines for metadata as a member of the new digital projects team put forth by the dean. And soon I'll be training cataloging and possibly special collection staff on these guidelines. One of our goals here is to significantly increase our digitization projects, while of course following best practices, so my work is supporting a library goal. I'm also doing research for a second article and looking into opportunities for national committee service.
Lizzy's made a great start on her career flight path. She's focusing on librarianship, which is 80% of our evaluation criteria at Wichita State. She's also made the first step toward a national reputation with the publication of a peer-reviewed article. She's been cautious about service commitments, selecting opportunities that interest her and help her network on campus. Some of her service has even been fun. Most importantly, Lizzy is achieving an appropriate balance in her work during her first year on tenure track. I sometimes hear faculty talk about how publications are all that count if you're in a tenure track position. But the first provost I worked under explained that myth. He said that he had never denied tenure to anyone for poor teaching because the department would take care of new faculty who didn't carry their share of the teaching load, so he could focus on scholarship. If you hear the only publications count myth, check your T&P guidelines. Even if your guidelines don't specify work percentages like ours do, they probably say something like, excellence in librarianship is required. As Lizzy progresses in her career, she needs to gain altitude by collaborating with colleagues, proposing improvements, and taking a leadership role in matters related to her specialty. Our colleagues are already beginning to consult her on metadata questions, so her career flight path is on a smooth upward curve.
Ginger has reached a sustainable altitude in her career with a good balance between the three areas we are evaluated on. Our colleagues respect her expertise as an acquisitions librarian. She proposes and implements projects such as the recently added demand-driven acquisitions. She has also done service routinely and has an ongoing research agenda. She has also been an incredible mentor to me. She's in excellent shape for her next goal, possibly becoming head of technical services.
The only problem with becoming head of tech services as the next goal for me is that we have a good head of technical services. And I kind of like Wichita. I'm not in a hurry to become a department head or in a hurry to move. So I'm continually looking for new challenges that will help me sustain altitude in my current position. Doing a little bit more than the minimum, or a lot more than the minimum, is a good thing. The dean just recognized that I do more than the minimum by inviting me to serve on the library's leadership team. That's going to look really good on my CV when I do decide that I want to be a head of tech services.
So let's change topics for a bit. Planning your work is only half of your job, really. How you describe your work so people don't just say you're just a bookkeeper or just a data entry clerk are also important. Think about these three questions. Why do you do what you do? Who does it help? And I think most importantly, how does it support the university's mission?
Many academic librarians are required to do an annual report of their work. Ours is called the Faculty Activity Report, or FAR. Annual reports are a pain, but they're usually the basis of annual evaluations and form part of the promotion file. As you write your annual report, focus on describing your work so that you show the expertise you bring to your job, that you emphasize your leadership role, and most importantly, show the impact of your work as vital to the teaching, learning, and research mission of your university. Descriptions are particularly important if your tenure and promotion file will be reviewed by a university-level committee. Can you describe your work so a chemistry professor sees that you're not just a bookkeeper or not just a data entry clerk? My goal is always to make the chemistry professors see me as an expert in the scholarly communication process.
For example, if I just said I learned RDA for training staff, it doesn't really convey much. Who cares? And it's kind of boring. So instead, I briefly explained what RDA was, that I did some research into how other libraries implemented the standard, and that I was training staff on RDA so that when they entered their records, it would help students and faculty retrieve information. I carefully thought out how to explain the impact of my work, then put a sample and a link to my Ferber Prezi slides in my first year faculty activity report. When I read the T&P committee's evaluation of my first year activity report, they asked me to share my presentations with public services too. Not only, of course, did it stroke my ego, but it showed that I could communicate my work in such a way that my tenured colleagues would be interested in it. Another example is my collaboration with special collections. I was more than just doing data entry, so instead of saying simply I cataloged some stuff for special collections, I needed to emphasize the intellectual aspect of analyzing materials and making the unique features of the material available and accessible. Cataloging isn't just typing what you see. It's thinking about how different users will look for information. As I collaborated with the curator, we talked about how researchers may use the material. I kept in mind questions like, how will a freshman search for this material? So if I was working on a rare 16th century book, I would ask that question. I would also ask the question, what about an expert in the field? How would an expert try to find this material? What unique features will the expert researcher be looking for versus the freshman researcher? Would this item be of interest to multiple disciplines? As I describe my work, I try to include some specific, very specific examples that may help others understand what I do and that I'm not just a data entry clerk.
Some of our colleagues very generously allowed us to go through their annual review documents for examples of how they describe their work. First, let's look at a couple of examples that show the expertise they brought to their jobs. When we implemented the electronic resource management system several years ago, I could have simply said that I participated on the implementation team. Instead, I focused on how my expertise as an acquisitions librarian contributed to using the ERMS as an assessment tool for serials reviews. First, I was careful to mention that I was collaborating with a team and to explain our team goal. I wanted to give credit claim credit for the same work. Give credit to your colleagues. Second, I talked about my specific role in the team as the expert in acquisitions and the leader of a small unit. Giving credit to your colleagues is good, but your evaluator also wants to know, what did you do? As I described my role, I included examples of how the cost notes were used to answer questions from my colleagues. I even put in a couple of specific questions that my colleagues had asked that I'd had to go back to those cost notes for when we were doing a serials review. I ended my description by reiterating that this project helped build an assessment tool. Assessment is a big deal in libraries today, so I wanted others to realize how my expertise contributed to assessment.
Another one of our colleagues listened to public service librarians talk about students wanting to find theses and dissertations by their advisor's previous students. She demonstrated her metadata expertise by proposing a project to enhance our existing T&D records in order to meet this need and by updating procedures for creating records in the future. She was also wise enough to note the resulting increase in usage that demonstrates the value of her work. Now we'll move on to leadership. Leadership in your specialty is also very important for librarians. Now we'll take a look at a couple of examples of leading projects. So remember when Ginger talked about describing her role on the ERMS implementation team? She mentioned starting off by talking about collaborating so evaluators wouldn't think she was claiming credit for everyone's work. The electronic resources librarian began her description by clearly stating that she led the team. You don't have to be a department head to be a leader. Our e-resources librarian led this team during her second year on the job. After she described the team and its goals, she then talked about her specific contributions to the project. Notice that she's demonstrating her leadership role in the library by mentioning exactly how this project impacts public service functions like interlibrary loan. She also pointed out how her work impacts library users, complete with descriptions of browsing e-journals and resolving access issues.
Another example, the year we piloted DDA, I emphasized my leadership role by discussing the workflow issues required to make DDA seamless to library users. One of our goals was for students and faculty to trigger purchases without knowing it. That required coordinating lots of technical issues with other people. There were times I felt like tearing my hair out. I didn't, though. I kept thinking, this is the job of a leader in acquisitions. I also talked about how DDA increased access to information without increasing the budget. That pointed out the value to our students. And I emphasized that DDA is part of our overall strategy to provide support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, wherever students are.
So one of the hardest things to do, but one of the most important, is to explain why in the world your work matters. Discussing the quality and impact of your work or of a project is more effective than just simply listing quantities or scheduled hours. So we've seen a few examples of that before. Remember the increased usage of the Theses and Dissertations project following the metadata enhancement. Let's look at some other examples of showing how our work matters.
This year, I'm investigating the feasibility of using interlibrary loan requests to build our collection. There are libraries that have been doing this for a decade or more. We never have here at Wichita State. When library users request books via ILL, they're telling us that we don't have something they need. Developing a project to rush order materials from ILL requests would demonstrate that we care about building a collection that today's students will use, a collection that meets their current needs. When we implement the project, I'll also have some statistics to show its impact. That kind of statistic actually does impress faculty outside the library.
And remember, not everything we do is a project, but we should focus on impact when describing ongoing work. Notice how one of our colleagues mentions supporting programs and students throughout her description of continuing collection development work. She focuses on supporting our engineering program, aligning collections with current needs, providing students with rapid information, and helping students find the best resources for their work. She doesn't say that she added, say, 114 or 200 books to the collection, because that number doesn't really show how her work supports the teaching, learning, and research mission of the university.
We do keep that kind of statistics. We just don't put it in annual reports that we're hoping that other people outside the library are going to read very often. Grouping activities is another way to show the impact of your work. Catalogers and metadata specialists often do lots of small enhancement projects. One of our catalogers grouped several small record enhancement projects last year in order to give them a little more impact in her FAR. All of these examples were designed to meet specific student needs. Notice how she mentions creative writing students in this example, education students in this example, and history and biology students in this example. By grouping these examples and being very specific, she's shown how enhancing records impacts teaching, learning, and research.
That last slide demonstrated grouping examples to show impact. Discussing details of specifics also helps show how your work helps students and faculty.
This is one of my favorites, mainly because I remember my colleague coming in, almost jumping up and down. She was so excited when the Anthropology Museum director approached her about increasing access to objects in the campus museum. It was sort of fun watching her be excited. In her description, she demonstrates leadership developing a project, expertise in working with standards, and impact by enhancing discoverability of the campus museum's collection. Until she had done this project, I had no idea that we had a great collection of ASMAT objects. ASMAT is a tribe in New Zealand. Thank you.
New Zealand.
I think it's New Zealand, New Guinea, somewhere over there. And there's a book about the ASMAT that's just come out recently that you might enjoy. It's about how one of the Rockefeller sons was killed while he was collecting ASMAT materials back in the 60s. It's sort of fun. Back on topic. Okay, so she used specific examples in her description of that project, the year she did her FAR, that demonstrated leadership, expertise, and impact. If you can begin a project description by saying that faculty outside the library consulted you the way she did here, that's even better.
Even when describing a major project that impacts many disciplines, you can weave in specific examples. Implementing the institutional repository was a major project, but it was also hard to explain its potential impact to non-librarians or people who aren't familiar with what an institutional repository is. Aviation engineering is a pretty big deal at Wichita State, so our colleague wove aviation scholarship into this description to show that the institutional repository is relevant to engineering faculty. She also used this example to showcase her leadership and her expertise. We especially like how the usage statistic at the bottom of the slide demonstrates the value of the library's new institutional repository in disseminating faculty scholarship around the world.
Focusing on show your expertise, show your leadership, show your impact on the teaching and learning mission of the university. Let's move on to scholarship. Many of us are required to do scholarship in order to make tenure and promotion. It's part of our job. Scholarship was one of my biggest fears when I started my first tenure track position. I'm a good writer, but I was really scared that I wouldn't have any ideas to write about. My first article started with me trying to figure out what engineers need. I'd taken a job at a land-grant institution with a lot of agriculture and engineering programs, and I'd been assigned to be the liaison and collection development specialist for 6 engineering departments. One small problem. My background is in education and law. I didn't even know why we would need 6 engineering departments. As far as I'm concerned, an engineer is a person who builds bridges. Why do you need 6 departments to learn how to build bridges? So, since I'm a librarian, I did what librarians do. I did a little research. I found out what the different branches of engineering are and suddenly started understanding engineers do more than just build bridges. I also found that there were some librarians in the past who've done citation studies to learn what their engineering students and faculties needed. They looked at what students cited in papers, what graduate students cited in theses and dissertations, what faculties cited in published articles, and analyzed that to figure out what do engineers need in different disciplines. I decided I could do that too. That might help me understand my engineering faculty and students better. And as I was working through this humongous pile of data, it suddenly dawned on me. I'm replicating those old studies. Those old studies are out of date. I could publish an article on this. So I did. My first peer-reviewed article as a professional librarian was the result of a graduate project. So I was also a staff member working on the institutional repository at my previous institution. My supervisor and I noticed that author names were beginning to be a problem. We had multiple name forms for the same author showing up in our browse by author lists. What in the world were we going to do about this? Also, have you ever noticed that people aren't exactly consistent with their name forms?
So I did some research on the name disambiguation tool within the institutional repository platform, as well as some external investigation, to help us to get all of the works by the same author together in the institutional repository for a graduate project. I then used that data from my staff job as the basis for a graduate project, or sorry, an article. Then, since no one else had come up with the method, my supervisor and I wrote together on this very topic, and it has been published.
Lizzy is very politely not saying that I'm one of her problem people. I use two forms of my name too. Today, for a presentation, I'm using Ginger Williams. When I publish, I get all formal and do Virginia K. Okay, like many librarians, Lizzy and I find that article ideas come from work issues. We have a tendency to talk about articles the way we're doing today as scholarship because we work at an institution that highly values peer-reviewed articles. But you need to pay attention to what counts at your library. Some institutions are like ours and highly value peer-reviewed articles, although they also count other things like presentations. Some institutions are just as happy with presentations. They don't make a distinction between the two. I know someone whose major scholarship work during his probationary period developing so useful that it got licensed by a commercial company, and he's now making money off of that. His university looked at that and said, that's sort of like faculty members who do patents and commercialize things. Yes, that's good scholarship. Remember, pay attention to what counts at your library. I even have a friend who works in a smaller institution who counted earning her second master's degree as meeting her scholarship requirement. That would not count here. So read your T&P guidelines.
So another aspect of some librarians' work is service. Librarians often have so many opportunities for service, it's not even funny, that we sometimes don't plan for it. But service activities can take a lot of time, and some service counts more, of course, toward promotion and tenure than others. Figuring out what counts and how much it counts can be very tricky.
Figuring out what counts as service is tricky because so much depends on your institutional mission and the specific circumstances. Serving on a university committee or a journal's editorial board counts as service everywhere I've ever looked at a T&P policy. Those two things are pretty standard. Committee work and editorial board work. But take writing book reviews. That counts as service at some institutions, and it's scholarship at other institutions. Check your T&P guidelines to find out how that would count. And then you have the problem of distinguishing between personal activities and professional service. Our library is fairly typical. We do distinguish between personal activities and professional service when it comes to tenure and promotion. For example, our library would consider leading a Girl Scout troop as a personal activity. It doesn't require using your professional expertise as a librarian. We would not count that as meeting the service requirement for promotion and tenure. If you're at an institution with a very strong community involvement policy, leading a Girl Scout troop might count. But the only way to know is to read your T&P policy and to ask questions. I will say, however, if you have any idea that you might move beyond your current institution or that you might one day want to go up for a unit head job or a director or dean job, you should be focusing most of your service on things that directly relate to your university and on things that use your professional expertise. Those two things count everywhere. Other service may not.
So one very valuable piece of information that Ginger gave to me early on was don't do so much in your first year that you burn out.
On the other hand, don't do so little that you crash land. Don't wait forever. Your first year, you should plan your career. Your second year, you should review your T&P policy and see what kind of progress you're making. Your third year, review it again.
So take time to understand the promotion and tenure requirements at your library. Start developing the habit of describing your work so non-librarians can understand how your work supports the teaching, learning, and research mission of your institution. And also select an appropriate focus for your scholarly and service activities, depending on your institutional requirements and your career goals.
If you aspire to move on to a different library, to become the head of your department, or to leave the library, or even just to earn a merit raise, if your library offers those, invest the time to do more than the minimum required. Doing the minimum tends to be a little boring anyway. And you're going to be interviewing soon. Start thinking before you go to that first interview, what sort of service might I be interested in? What sort of research might I be interested in? You're going to get asked questions about that if you're interviewing at a tenure track institution. Be ready for them.
And another piece of advice I can offer is when you are looking at job descriptions, remember when you're filling out your cover letter, your resume, everything that you need to turn in, keep in mind it's best to really touch on all of the topics that they are asking for in their job description. This can also help you show your value, essentially. If you, for example, one of the things that I did was that I didn't have a lot of collaboration with outside faculty of the library as a staff member, but outside of the library I did take part in a community group that I mean, almost all of the board members were faculty members. So instead of, like when it said something in the job description here about, you know, collaborating with faculty and outside sources, I, of course, said straight out, while I don't have experience working with faculty, I do have interaction with faculty via this group. So you can do things like that. Just be creative. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. And the reason we have this slide up is look back at your position description occasionally. That's the position description for a faculty member. It uses faculty language. Use that language when you're describing your work too.
And thank you for coming. And if you have, of course, if you have questions, let us know. And our contact information is up on the screen for you.
Thank you, Lizzy and Ginger. We have some questions, so let's get started on those. Are there particular issues that people in technical services have that librarians in public services don't have, and what are those?
You have to think really hard about how to explain your impact in technical services. Public services librarians tend to interact directly with students and with faculty. Tech services librarians don't do as much of that. And so you have to, when you're trying to describe your work, think, how do I make it clear to a faculty member who's reading my description that I am a colleague, that I am doing work that is just as intellectually challenging and that has just as much impact on his teaching and his research as that librarian that he sees every day at the desk and that he emails back and forth. It's hard, but if you think about it, you can do it.
I also keep in mind that technical services and public services support each other. We're not completely separate. Does that kind of make sense there?
Yes, yeah. I tend to put examples in my FAR, and I know you did this too.
Oh, yes.
Because I saw them when I was on the tenure committee.
Right.
Of questions that people from outside technical services emailed me and the answers that I gave them. Mm-hmm. It sort of reminds people that our work is essential to the public end too.
Do we have any other questions?
Okay. Can you suggest any tools you use to help you choose the words? Are there any books or anything that you use to come up with the words in your descriptions?
Item 1, go back to your position description. Mm-hmm. Check the other job ads that are out there in the Chronicle of Higher Education and Inside Higher Ed. They are using language typically that got approved by the Provost's office as describing a faculty level position. Third thing, my colleagues have been really generous in sharing their wording. And I hate to say it, but you know those basic intro career books that talk about how to describe things and make you sound good in interviews? Sometimes they have lists of words, and some of those words are pretty darn good.
And also, yeah, like Ginger said, I mean, some of our colleagues were
Great, thank you. How did you two identify which journals to submit articles?
I read a lot. I scan journals, and I've got myself on the lists for a lot of different journals to send me table of contents. I tend to submit articles to journals that have had articles that interested me. So I tend to submit to things like Library Resources and Technical Services. Disclaimer, I'm on the board of that. To Issues in Science and Technology Libraries, because I do collection development for engineering, so that fits for me. Collection Management, Technical Services Quarterly. Lizzy, you've submitted to a couple of other things because you have some other specialties.
Yes, in addition to, like Ginger, I also read from different journals, but I also keep in mind the author rights. If I as the author can retain those rights, I'm more willing to go for that journal than if I have to sign away my rights. That's not to say that I'll never do that. Just currently, I have a really big open access interest, and so that's kind of where my publication interests are right now.
I'll give you another tip. When you're looking at journals and trying to decide which one to submit to, check to see if the articles in that journal have a little squib at the beginning or the end of each article that says when the article was submitted, when it was accepted, and then look at when it was actually published. If you're tenure track faculty and you need to get things out quickly, and sometimes you need to do that, you may want to occasionally submit to somewhere that's not quite as high a level as you could aspire to in order to make sure you get it out fast. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The last time I checked, it took about 2 years to get something published in CNRL.
And Ulrich's is another good source to look for journals. So if you have something in mind, type it into the Ulrich's database and you'll get a bunch of stuff. So
next.
Great. Do you have tips on what makes a successful publication that is accepted and how to handle rejection, how you can turn that around?
The first article that I had published, I got a 7-page rejection letter. I cried. Then I looked at it and said, you know, they would not have wasted their time writing me 7 pages just to say, we're rejecting this. So I went back through it and looked to see why are they rejecting it and what can I do to improve it. And after a minute, I figured something out. I kind of sort of forgot that I'm not an expert at statistics, and it really showed in my paper. So I went and found somebody who knew more about statistics to give me some help. Another thing is, if you don't read peer-reviewed journals, it's hard to write in the style that they're wanting. Believe it or not, it actually does help to make it a habit, and I do this no matter how tight I am on time. I read a journal article every single week. Sometimes I do that when I'm doing things like sitting at the doctor's office waiting for an appointment, but I read one every single week.
Another thing that I myself and some of the other tenure track librarians have done is to form a writing group. We have something called the Pub Club, and we meet, at one point we were meeting every week because we all had heavy things that we were working on, and it's kind of kicked down to about once a month because we're all kind of busy with everything. But forming a writing group with your colleagues is invaluable. It's been amazing for me personally, so that's another thing.
My first year as a tenure track librarian, I also went to my supervisor with an idea that I had because she had successfully published articles before. And she very generously asked me if I wanted someone to read drafts for it, or if I was interested in a co-author because she knew somebody else who had a similar research interest that might be willing to co-author with me. And it was someone who had published before. That helped a lot. Next question.
Those are very encouraging. Thank you. And let me remind everyone that we have time for additional questions, so please continue to add them to the question box. Let's see. Can you give us tips for keeping track of all your activities?
Felicity, you faded out on us. All we heard was keeping track of all your activities.
Do you have, I said the stories you told, those were very encouraging for publication. Do you have any tips you can give us for keeping track of all those different activities in the different areas so that the information is ready there for writing?
I actually use OneNote. At first I was very resistant to it because I didn't like it at all. But now daily I will go in and keep a log of what I've done. Depending on the project. I will, if it's something that I need to have details on, I'll go ahead and map those out for myself. And if it's just a general, this is what I did today, I'll list that. But yeah, I find if I keep a log of what I've done, then going back and writing my annual review is a lot easier than having to dig through all these files. So
I keep an activity log in Excel that has everything I do, which is helpful for the annual review. But I think your question may have also asked about keeping track of ideas for publication. I do that two ways. One, I jot them in the log since it's open all the time when I'm at work. First thing I do in the morning, open my log. The other thing, I'm old-fashioned on this, and I like office supplies. I have a stack of colored index cards in my desk drawer. I get an idea, I pull one out, I jot it down, I throw it back in the desk drawer. Yeah, it's a little crazy, but then I can sort those cards out and kind of group them together and pick things that look interesting.
Great. What recommendations do you have for people who want to be in a tenure track position but currently aren't? So they have to spend their 40 hours or whatever now doing their job, but want to squeeze in some other activities that will help them get a tenure position.
I've just come off my third search committee in 3 years. So when one of the criteria is that you show promise toward tenure, we will look at that and say, are you doing any service work? If you've written a review of a professional book and had it published in a journal, hey, that's service work. And it shows that you can write and meet a deadline. If you write newsletter articles, it demonstrates that you can write. If you actually mention in your cover letter a specific idea for research, demonstrates that you're at least thinking that direction. And I hate to say it, but even if you are in a tenured eligible job where your T&P policy specifies that 10% of your time is supposed to be spent on research, it doesn't happen. The only way 10% of my time gets spent on research is if I either come in on the weekends or I stay after or I take stuff home. I think Lizzy's doing a little bit better at that.
I'm trying.
But
Yeah.
But it's you know, if you're at a tenure eligible position, you're not working a 40-hour work week. Not if you're going to make it.
Right. It's a big job, but
Great.
it's totally worth it.
Okay, we have time for one question, and since there's not any pending, I'm going to ask you, you mentioned that at Wichita State you have promotion and tenure,
Mm-hmm.
and that one person might get both. So what's the difference there between those two?
If we hire you as a new tenure track librarian, then, and this is where Lizzy is, Lizzy has 5 years that she is on tenure track, assuming she passes her annual evaluations. This is not to scare you, Lizzy. Quit crossing your fingers and praying. She's doing great. She has 5 years to work toward tenure and promotion. During her 6th year, she is going to submit a dossier, an application, explaining why she meets the requirements, and a secondary dossier, a great big file box with documentation of what she has done over the last 5 years. She has to show us, according to our T&P guidelines, that she is excellent as a librarian, that she has done some service at the library, and that she is making progress toward a regional or national reputation as a scholar. She's in great shape on that. I'm not worried about that. But if she doesn't accomplish that during the 6th year, 6 different groups of people evaluate her file. If she doesn't accomplish that, at the end of the year she gets a letter that says, "We're very sorry to inform you that you have not made tenure. You have a 1-year terminal contract." So being tenure track typically means that you're on probation. You have a certain amount of time to convince the university that you're worth giving tenure to and keeping around for the rest of your career. Promotion is a completely separate matter, although many institutions tie them together. Promotion, you get promoted from a librarian 1 to a librarian 2, or to an assistant professor to an associate professor. It's a higher rank. Typically, there are some things that you're not eligible for until you've been promoted, and typically you get a raise when you get promoted. Like I said, here it's been a dozen years since anybody has made tenure at this university without getting promoted too. So we tend to think of them together.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for sharing what we've learned about tenure and promotion over the years. And just a reminder, everyone, you'll be getting the slides, so you'll have the examples they've sent to you. So,
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you.
So everyone, you will soon be getting a short online evaluation form. And on behalf of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, I encourage you to fill that out because we use those to plan our future events. So we have an additional events coming up this year, including some webinars. Next week, we have 2 no-cost preservation webinars for Preservation Week. We have e-resource coming up and 2 additional MOOCs webinars that have been very popular. We also have 1 additional e-forum. These are 2-day email discussions. So you can sign up at the ALCTS website. And of course we have web courses that we offer throughout the year. So you see several listed here. In addition, we have a Fundamentals of Cataloging series that we'll be offering soon, and these are 4 to 6 week courses where you meet weekly with the teacher, have homework, and learn about these topics. So thank you also to our technical support, Mary Acock and Vicki Grzinski. They help us make sure these webinars run smoothly. Thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we hope you join us at other ALCTS continuing education offerings in the future. Goodbye.